Welcome back to Odelia Vlogs. Today we can study Research Methodology Module 3. So I am focusing on exam point of views. So you have to study all what I am going to teach here. First is research design. We can study the meaning of research design. It is a map developed to guide the research. It's a part of the planning stage of research, a blueprint for the collection, measurement, and analysis of data. A research design gives direction to the study. We can study the need of research design. First of all, it gives direction to the study, as I told you earlier. Next, it ensures that the research is economically and smoothly conducted. Next, it helps the researcher in deciding relevant and irrelevant facts. It reduces inaccuracy. It eliminates bias, or bias means errors. Next, it minimizes wastage of time. It helps the researcher to organize his ideas. Now we can study the concepts of research design. There are 8 concepts. I will explain each and every one in detail. First is variable. A variable is any concept that can take any quantitative value. There are different types of variables, namely independent variable, dependent variable, discrete variable, continuous variable, and extraneous variable. Independent variable are those variables which can be manipulated by the researcher and the resulting effects are measured. Example, study of influence of price on the demand of TVs has price as an independent variable. Second one is dependent variable. These are the variables that depend on or are a consequence of other variable. Here in the above example, the quantity demanded is the dependent variable. Next, we can study discrete variable. They are those variables which can be expressed only in integer values. For example, number of people in China, number of people in India, number of people in any place. Okay. Next is continuous variable. Continuous variable are those variables which can assume any value even in decimal points. For example, height, weight, 89.2, 71.3, height again 163.7, like that. So these are all related to the above said variable, continuous variable. Next is extraneous variable. Besides the independent variable, a dependent variable can be influenced by other independent variables which are not a part of the study. Such variables are termed as extraneous variable. For example, quantity demanded may be responding to the time of purchase also. That is festive season. During festive season, we know the prices of all things will be at a high level. It will be at the peak level. Meat, vegetables, etc. This will be in Onam season and all vegetables will be of very high price. But and also during Vishu and again in Christmas season or Ramzan or Eid, meat, the price of meat, chicken, this all will be very high. But people will have to buy. Okay. Next, we can study what is a confounded relationship. That's the next concept of research design. When the dependent variable is not free from the influence of extraneous variable, the relationship between the dependent and independent variable are said to be known as in a confounded relationship. Now we can study what is an experiment. An experiment is conducted when the researcher manipulates one or more independent variable and measures their effect on the dependent variable. Next is treatments. The independent variable are also called treatments, or in other words we can say the different condition under which the experiment is conducted is termed as treatments. For example, the different types of teaching methods being studied are the treatments whose effect is being measured. Next is control. The effect of extraneous variable can be minimized using control. Control refers to the experimental condition which are designed to minimize the influence of extraneous variables. Next is test unit or experimental unit. It refers to the individuals, organization, block, etc., which are subjected to the treatments. It may be a person, a social structure, or any geographical area. Next comes experiment group. While conducting an experiment, those units which are subject to the treatments under study form an experimental group. For example, in a study on measuring the effect of new teaching method on student performance, the group which is subject to new teaching methods will be the experimental group. Next is control group. In an experiment, the group of units which is exposed to usual conditions is termed as control group. The purpose of control group is to measure the effect of extraneous variable on the study. So these are the concepts and you have to study this for your exam. Now we can study the very important question, elements of research design. It will be also asked as guidelines of research design or what are the components of research design. So same question, the answer is the same. First one, title of the problem. A researcher should be very careful in selecting the best caption for his research. The title should be as brief and precise as possible. Second one, statement of the problem. The problem to be investigated should be stated clearly and briefly. The significance of the problem, its contribution expected to make, should be specifically indicated. Next is objectives of the research. Objectives help the research studies. These objectives may be stated in the form of questions or in statements. Next is scope of the study. Scope depends on several factors like money, time, etc. Research design should indicate the scope of the study. How much time we have, what is the capital we have, this all should be mentioned. Next is survey of literature. Surveying the existing literature in the field of study is an important step in the formulation of research design. The survey of literature helps to get acquainted with different meanings given to certain concepts and usage of different concepts in various studies, and also to get an in-depth knowledge of the problem. Next, we can study conceptualization of terms used. Every researcher has to state the meaning attached to the different terms used in the study. Next is formulation of hypothesis. Formulation of hypothesis is considered to be a principal instrument in research. It's a tentative generalization, the validity of which remains to be tested. We know the different types of tests. T-test is a test, Y-test, etc. Next is eighth point, that is selection of sample. Researcher has to select a sample from the universe on which he has to study. The sample size should be neither too small nor too large. So it should be adequate in size. Ninth point is data collection. The research scholar has to indicate in the research design about the nature of the data and the sources from which he has to collect the data. There are two sources of data, primary data and secondary data. Primary data are those collected specifically for the purpose of a study under consideration. It's a direct source of information, first-hand information. Secondary data is the information that has been gathered not for the immediate study but for some other purposes. It is collected by people or agencies in response to some other problem rather than the problem at hand. It is easily available because people can read books, they can search internet, they can read magazines, manuals, government manuals, etc. and they will get lot of information, and these are all secondary data. We will study in the fourth module in detail the sources of secondary data and primary data. Now we can study the last point, that is processing and analysis of data. That includes the data collected from various sources must be properly processed and analyzed. The researcher has to be very cautious and vigilant while analyzing the data. He may depend on mathematical and statistical techniques like linear programming, correlation, regression, etc. Now we can study sampling design. First of all, you have to know some fundamentals of sampling design. What is universe? or what is sample, what is sampling frame, etc. So we can study in detail what is universe. Universe is also known as population. It's the aggregate of all the units to be studied in any field of inquiry. That is the group of individuals under study. If you are studying an organization, Apollo Tires, the whole people working in Apollo are the population or universe of that organization. Now, sample. A finite subset of a population selected from it, that is from the population, with the objective of investigating its properties is called sample. That is, sample is a representative part of the population. If you are focusing on Apollo or FACT or any HMT or like that, the whole people present in that organization is the population, and from that a small sample we are selecting, and that is a representative part of the population, and that is known as sample. Next is sampling frame. Sampling frame is a representation or list of all elements of target population from which the sample is to be drawn. For example, telephone directory. From the telephone directory, we can get the details of all persons living in different places. Next is sampling design. The blueprint for obtaining a sample from the sampling frame is termed as sampling design, and it refers to the techniques used in drawing a sample, and that we will study in detail. Now we can study the last point, that is element or unit. It's known as sampling unit. An element refers to the object about which or from which the information is to be collected. A sampling unit could be an individual, institution, etc. Now we can study the steps in planning. Now we can go to the next important topic, that is the steps in sampling. First one is defining the population. The first step is the most critical step, wherein a researcher has to give an operational definition for his relevant population. Population in the most common form implies the total number of individuals in the area of study from whom information is being sought. The members who possess the characteristics or information required by the researcher constitute the target population. Second one is defining the sampling unit. The sampling unit is the person, place, or object about which or from which the information is required for research. For example, in case of study conducted on newspaper readership, an entire household could be a sampling unit. Next step is determining the sampling frame. It is also known as source list. It is a comprehensive listing of all the members of a population. I told you earlier, a telephone directory is a good example for a sampling frame. Next, we can study the selecting the sampling technique. The researcher must decide on the type of sample, that is, probability or non-probability based sampling techniques. The decision as regard to the technique to be used is affected by the objectives of study, the level of accuracy required, time and cost, etc. Now we can study the next step, that is determining the sample size. A sample size is considered optimum if it fulfills the requirements of efficiency, representativeness, reliability and flexibility. So a sample size should not be too small nor too large. An adequate size is to be selected. The last point is execution of sampling process. It's the last step which involves working out the details of drawing a sample. Procedures for selecting each unit must be worked out. Now we can go to the different sampling techniques. There are two types of sampling. First one is probability sampling, or it's also known as random sampling, and another one is non-probability sampling or non-random sampling. So what do you mean by probability sampling? Probability sampling is nothing but we have to know that every members of the population has a chance of being selected. That is known as probability sampling. So every member of the population has a chance of being selected. If I come to the class and select some students randomly for going for an event or for going for the Kalolsavam of MG University and all, so that is known as probability sampling, and just coming to the class and just selecting some members of the population. Okay, so we can study different types of probability sampling. First one is simple random sampling, and simple random sampling is, in this method, every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. It can be done either by lottery method or by random numbers, table of random numbers. So we can study that in very detail. You have to study this. It will be a sure question, sometimes for 2 marks, sometimes for 5 marks and all. This will come, and for an essay question also, this is a sure question. So lottery method. There are different types of, I told you, simple random sampling can be done either by lottery method or by table of random numbers. So what do you mean by lottery method? We have all took lottery, no? So we know how the lot is selected and all. So let me say, first of all, under this method, all items of the universe are numbered or named of separate slips of paper of identical size and shape. The slips are then folded and mixed up in a container. A blind fold selection is then made of the number of slips required to constitute the desired size of sample. While preparing the slips, it must be seen that slips are of identical size, shade, or color. Otherwise, there is a possibility of selecting a particular slip. So, the selection of items can be made by some mechanical process also. You have seen lottery, Sikkim lottery and all before. You have seen that mechanical process and all, no? So that is lottery method. Second one is table of random numbers. Using random number table, we can select random samples in an easy manner. Several standard tables of random numbers are available, just like Tippett's random number tables, Fisher and Yates tables, C.R. Rouse tables, Kendall and B.B. Smith tables, etc. You have to know these names because sometimes it might be asked for the 2 marks question. What are the types of random number tables available? So you have to write Tippett's random number tables, Fisher and Yates tables, etc. Now, random numbers avoid any bias in selecting the sample. The use of tables of random numbers involves a lot of steps. First one is that each member of the population is assigned a number. From some random point of the table of random numbers, the random numbers are read out. The item whose number is identical with the random number read out is selected. The selection of the items is continued until the desired number of items are selected. And this is how sampling is done. Now we can study the second type of sampling, that is systematic sampling. It is a type in which sample members from a large population are selected according to a random starting position from the range 1 to n, but with a fixed periodic interval called sampling interval. This interval is calculated by dividing population size by the desired sample size. Then choose every nth number as your sample. Third one, stratified sampling. Stratified sampling is done in a heterogeneous population. We divide the population into different subpopulations known as strata, such as each stratum are homogeneous. For example, students of college can be divided into strata on the basis of gender, courses offered, age, etc. Next is cluster sampling. In cluster sampling, researcher divides a population into smaller groups known as clusters. Then they select among these clusters to form a sample. It's a method used to study large populations, particularly those that are widely geographically dispersed. Now we can study what is non-probability sampling or non-random sampling. is a technique where the elements do not have a known chance of being selected in the sample. There are four types you have to study. Convenience sampling. What is convenience sampling? In this, the researcher has the freedom of choosing any respondent based on his convenience. For example, if we have to do a survey in a shopping mall, what we will do? We will ask questions to the people who happen to pass there at that time. So it is at our convenience. Second one is judgment sampling. It's a kind of purposive sampling where those respondents are deliberately made a part of the sample by virtue of their position, knowledge, or any other criteria which meet the research purpose. By thinking some person, by seeing a person, oh, he might be much intelligent, he might be very powerful, like that, we will just go and ask questions. So that is what judgment sampling, according to our judgment. Next is quota sampling. In this method, the researcher decides the selection of sampling based on some quota. In quota sampling, the researcher makes sure that the final sample must meet its quota criteria. It's a non-probability sampling method that relies on the non-random selection of a predetermined number, and this predetermined number is known as quota. For this, the researcher divides the population into homogeneous groups and then recruits sample units until he reaches his quota. Next, we can study. I'll give you an example for quota sampling. If you are sampling 8,000 students, your quota sample might be 100. So choose your participants adhering to the subgroups. Okay, that is an example just for your reference. I just said you no need to write for the examples and all, just for your to keep in memory. Next, we can study snowball sampling. That's a sure question for 2 marks also. Study it very well. In this, a set of respondents are selected initially and interviewed. After this, these respondents are asked to list the names of other people who, in their opinion, are a part of the target population. Thus, it is like setting the ball in motion, whereby referrals are obtained from referrals, thus creating a snowball effect which keeps on growing in size as it rolls down. So its name came snowball. For example, medical researchers use snowball sampling to collect responses from patients with rare disease. Excuse me. Next, also investigation purposes. For investigation purposes, for example, for to know about murder cases and all, drug drug trafficking, drug abuses, etc., the investigators use snowball sampling because they can get from every reference they can get another sample to ask. So these referrals will make a snowball. I think you understood this. Now we can go to the last topic of module 3. It's also very important. What are the criteria for selection of a sampling technique? In a sampling analysis, two kinds of costs are involved. The cost of collecting the data and the cost of an incorrect inference resulting from the data. Researcher must keep in view the two causes of incorrect inferences. One is systematic bias or systematic error, and another one is sampling error. Systematic bias occurs if the sampling frame does not represent the universe properly, or if the individuals undergo observation act in a manner different from if they are not kept under observation. Also, it occurs if the devices used for measuring the values are defective. So, systematic bias results from errors in sampling procedures, and it can be reduced by increasing the sampling size. The causes for this type of bias can be detected and corrected. Now, sampling errors are the errors arising due to drawing inference about the population on the basis of sample. When the sample size increases, sampling errors decrease. If the population is homogeneous, the sampling error becomes smaller. But increase in the size of sample results into increase of cost. So selecting a better sampling design which has a small sampling error is the solution. While selecting a sampling technique, a researcher must ensure that the technique adopted causes a small sampling error, controls the systematic bias in a better way, and reduces the cost involved. So these are the criteria, and I have taught only what you have to study in an exam point of view, because these are all the sure questions asked regularly in the university exam. Okay, so if you have any doubt, you can comment in the chat box. Now, thank you so much, children.